Historians speak of a crisis of the late Republic, and that term can be a little misleading because it sounds like that's a single event. But in reality, what they mean by crisis normally is this century-long kind of slow collapse of the institutions and the stability of the Republic, which is transformed actually rather gradually into the empire and into an autocracy from a broadly participatory representative government. And so, if the late Republic actually makes a nice comparison point for some, kind of modern phenomena. We can look at the collapse of democracy, for instance, in the interwar period in states like Germany, and kind of compare that to how that happened in the late Republic. We can also, if we are concerned about the slow decline of democracy in the West, or in the United States more specifically, the late Republic is often used as a kind of comparison point, or a place we can look at for detecting warning signs. But anyway, those are some ways that this period, which to me is one of the more fascinating periods in all of world history, the ways that those have been used. Let's talk about why there is a crisis in this period. This has a lot to do with expansion. We talked last video about expansion, and looked at some of the lands that Rome came to control, not just all of Italy, but most of the Western Mediterranean, including the lands that had formerly been occupied by Carthage, which was a kind of maritime-based empire that was conquered by Rome. And even parts of the Hellenistic kingdoms that were crafted, a couple of centuries before by Alexander the Great, those fell under the sway of Rome as well. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome controlled a tremendous amount of territory. About half of what it would come to control ultimately, mind you, but still a lot of territory. And they had not made any real adjustments in the political system to account for this expansive territory they controlled. For instance, slavery was very common in the Roman world because the Romans had fought all of these wars. They had taken war captives. And so hundreds of thousands, if not, millions perhaps, of people, were in some condition of slavery. There was no kind of regulation made of this. It was simply enterprising, entrepreneurial people who owned lots of slaves and used them to various ends to mine minerals, or to farm, or to do whatever. There wasn't a kind of regulation on how many slaves somebody should own, how they should be treated, these sorts of things in Rome, right? And the more and more people who fell into slavery, the more discontented the kind of subject population was, the more likelihood of a slave revolt. And there would be some slave revolts that helped destabilize Rome in the late Republic period. The most famous led by the slave Spartacus in the 70s BCE, put down by Crassus, and made into a Hollywood film in 1960. One of the better, I think, historical films ever made. In addition to massive numbers of slaves, the Romans also now had possession of huge tracts of land, just massive territories. And there wasn't a lot of regulation made in the government for how to handle those lands. Most of these fell into the category of what was called public land in Rome. But the question was, who controlled public land? Well, usually it was some enterprising patrician who would just sort of take control of these lands, and with large numbers of slaves, would put them into cultivation in these things that the Romans called latifundia. That's the Latin term for this. Really, that's just translated loosely. It would just be slave plantation. And the latifundia were problematic in a number of ways. First of all, these were hotbeds of potential revolt from slaves. But moreover, with these patricians controlling these huge tracts of land farmed by slaves, they were able to produce agricultural goods at a scale that the majority of farmers in the Roman world, meaning the plebeians who owned small family farms, were simply not able to keep up with. I mean, there's a concept called economies of scale that you learn about in economics, that the larger you get up to a certain point, the less it costs to produce the next unit of production, right? And so, these patricians employed economies of scale to kind of drive competition down and to drive prices down, and this hurt many of the plebeians. Many of them, in fact, were forced to sell their farms because they simply couldn't keep up. And part of that, too, is that plebeians were often conscripted into the army. They would leave for months or even years at a time to fight. They were not paid, or at least not paid kind of regularly for their service in the army. It was supposed to be their duty to fight. They were paid maybe out of the spoils of war if Rome conquered some territory or something like that. But they often returned to their farms to find them in a dilapidated condition. And that was another factor in the latifundia kind of forcing many plebeian farmers out. This led to a tremendous urban expansion, especially cities like Rome itself, where these poor plebeian farmers would sell their farms, move into the city looking for work, and often wouldn't find it, and end up as this teeming mass, right, of discontented urban populace, which was another source of instability, right? That enterprising, ambitious politicians could use this group as a means to rise to great political power. And populism becomes one of the strategies used by some of these politicians. Another key question was the status of what the Romans called the socii, or the allies. These were people who had allied with Rome over the centuries, many of the other peoples of Italy, for instance, but even people outside of Italy, right? They were allies of Rome. They wanted the same privileges as Romans had. In some cases, they had started to integrate with them over the centuries, and yet they lacked Roman citizenship and all of the benefits that went along with that. And so, these politicians broke into kind of two camps in this period. This isn't to say that they formed political parties, but there was one group who sought to champion the cause of the common people and of the allies who were pressing for citizenship, right? The Roman sources call these the populares, or the populists. And then there was a group who really didn't want to extend citizenship to allies, didn't want to change the patricians' corner on the market of these public lands and all of that. And the Roman sources call these the optimates. And we might simply say the conservatives, who really didn't want to, bring about a lot of changes, wanted to keep the privileges of the patricians in place. Now, those are some of the causes of the instability and the crisis of the late Republic. But we can't tell this story without referring to a select group of individuals who exercised their own personal ambitions and tried to rise to outsized political power, and in the process contributed in various ways to the destabilization. Really, they're just adding like powder to the keg here, waiting to strike a match, for this whole thing to explode. Each of them made their own contribution. And the textbook goes through some of these. And so I don't want to, go into every detail. Let me just say one or two things about each of these individuals. So starting in the 130s BCE, there were two brothers named Tiberius and Gaius, surnamed Gracchus. And so the plural on that would be the Gracchi brothers. Just add an I for the US at the end of their surname. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus both were from, at least on their mother's side, a very old and prestigious patrician family. On their father's side, however, they were plebeians. And so they used the office of tribune. Rather than try to get elected as consul and go the traditional route, they both sought election as tribune. And as tribune, with the support of the common people whom they, claimed to represent and kind of champion, they pushed for land reform, stripping the patrician hold on the latifundia away, and This did not make them popular, certainly with their patrician colleagues, but it did kind of pave the path for other politicians to follow. That the message was, if you can seize on the energy of the common people, if you can become a populist, right, you can rise to great power. And Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus exercised tremendous power. They formed a land commission where they went about redistributing land that had been kind of taken control of by patricians. I will say that both Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were assassinated, or rather one of them was about to be assassinated and committed suicide. I believe that was Gaius Gracchus, but many of his supporters were killed before he offed himself, right? So, this was, politics really started to turn violent at this time. This stirred up a lot of passions from people, both on the populist side and the more conservative side. A second figure of note here emerged toward the end of the 2nd century BCE, kind of the last decade of that century. His name was Marius, and notably, especially because we're going to talk about Cicero in the next video, Marius was what the Romans called a novus homo. That meant he was the first in his family line to rise to high political office, specifically to the office of consul. So he was from a plebeian family, but he, came into the same kind of power as the patricians did. This did not endear him to the patricians, and Marius spent a lot of his career trying to kind of impress his patrician peers with the power that he wielded. I don't know that he was ever able to fully do that, and this may have been the chip on his shoulder that led him to all of these great ambitious achievements. The most notable thing about Marius, though, is that he created the first professional army in Rome. Rome had had a citizen army up to this point. When Rome was, needed to fight a battle, they would conscript citizens into service. And as I said, there was no regular system of pay or anything like that. It was sort of like you served because it was your duty, and you received some of the rewards, perhaps out of the spoils of war, maybe a little bit of a pension or a salary or something like that. But nothing regular. There was no kind of regulated system for paying soldiers. And this gave Marius the chance to create his own professional army, which he paid himself. And as a result of that, effectively all of the soldiers in his army became his clients. Remember, we talked about patrons and clients last time. They were loyal to him. And Marius used this client army as a kind of leverage point to come to great power in Rome, to be elected as consul, and notably Marius was elected for 5 straight terms as consul. That was unprecedented in Roman history. Nobody had done that. There was an opposition that rose against him and denied him the office of censor, which he sought after that. Censor was in some ways even more powerful than the consul because they conducted the periodic census, but I don't want to get into the kind of details about that. Marius was denied. Later he did come back and was consul again a couple more times, so 7 times total in his life. But using that army is really the important thing. Following in his wake was somebody who had served under Marius but despised Marius, and this guy's name was Sulla. Sulla, by the way, this is Marius, a bust of Marius here on the left. This is Sulla on the right. The defacing may have been purposeful because Sulla was not the most popular character in Roman history. Sulla, after kind of following the path of Marius, but taking the more of the optimates, more of the conservative route to shore up patrician privilege and all of that. Sulla also used a client army, fought a civil war against his opponents. Marius was an opponent, but he died in the meantime. It was really kind of those who were trying to keep the camp of Marius alive. They fought a civil war against each other, and at the end of that civil war, Sulla emerged as he had himself effectively appointed as dictator. And rather than lay down the dictatorship at the end of 6 months, he retained it. He forced the Senate to acknowledge him as dictator multiple times, ended up serving about 4 years as dictator. And during his time as dictator, during that lengthy period, he undid most of the reforms that had been enacted by figures like Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus and Marius. Anything that, had stripped away patrician privilege or compromised the patricians' ability to do whatever they pleased, pretty much. Sulla did away with all of that. He created strict limits on who could hold office, and he, did away with a lot of the powers that had been granted to the tribunes and to the plebeian council and some of these things. He elevated the position of the Senate even more. At the end of his dictatorship, there was nobody left really to oppose him, but neither was there anyone who was willing to continue along those lines. The other thing that Sulla did, I should say, that was quite unpopular, obviously, was to carry out proscriptions. Proscriptions means to eliminate your political rivals by forcing them into exile or simply executing them. There were hundreds of senators who were proscribed, and they either were, if they couldn't escape, they were caught and imprisoned and executed. Some of them did go into exile. Sulla tried to force, so a good example would be Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a very young patrician at the time, and he had married a relative of Marius, and Sulla didn't like that much, and so he tried to force Julius Caesar, and kind of gave him an ultimatum. He said, you will divorce your wife and marry somebody else, or I'm going to, have you arrested and executed. And Caesar, rather than divorce his wife, chose to flee the city of Rome, go into exile. He would later come back, obviously. But that's the kind of hold that Sulla had on life in Rome for a few years. And so, these, and then he also prescribed several hundred others, probably upwards of 2,000 to 3,000 other people who he saw as threats in Rome. This made him unpopular. By the time Sulla died, there was really nobody left to carry on in this same kind of program. There were beneficiaries of Sulla's programs, like Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, was a beneficiary. He had served under Sulla. Sulla, used some of the. Whenever a patrician was exiled or executed, their property would be seized, and Sulla distributed this among his supporters. And so Pompey grew quite wealthy and prestigious under kind of serving under Sulla, as did Crassus. And so Pompey and Crassus on the kind of back of their success under Sulla. Emerged as candidates for high political leadership in the aftermath. Julius Caesar returned from exile as a pauper, but partly with the support of Crassus, he was able to rise quickly, mostly through his own personal skill. Caesar was very able, strategist politically, and he impressed both Pompey and Crassus, I should say, ultimately, such that these three entered into a partnership known as the First Triumvirate, but that's something we'll talk about later. So you can see the kind of mess that's going on in Rome, right? By the time that Cicero and Catiline, who were the main characters in the story we want to tell here, emerge around this, the early 60s BCE. Sulla dies, I think, in 72 or 71 BCE. And so just a few years after that, that's the situation, that Rome is still reeling from all of these these reactionary measures that Sulla put into place. So I'll stop there, and we'll go on and talk about Cicero and Catiline in the next video.